Hey, podcasters, great show for you today. We start in the heart of darkness with Venezuela and the celebrities that just love Hugo Chavez. Then right into something that has now been deplatformed. I'm sorry, not deplatformed, but got us demonetized. Demonetized on YouTube, and that is for telling you who we believe Congresswoman Omar is. If you have a problem with today's episode, you should listen to tomorrow's podcast. Then had a great conversation about freedom of speech and what do we do? Do we break up these big social media companies, these tech companies? I don't necessarily agree with that, but what do we do? Because freedom of speech is even hitting you. They're trying to curtail your speech, and I got a letter in from a listener yesterday that I shared with you. And then the hate crime hoax, how the left is selling a fake race war. And, of course, we end with Tony Robbins. My visit to him. I'm going to be gone over the next few days, and I'm going to go see Tony Robbins. And he's going to motivate and blah, blah, blah. I'm much more interested in the Ricky Gervais show on Netflix called Afterlife. Really funny. Really funny. Really, really good. Harsh, but really funny. That's all on today's podcast.
You're listening to the best of the Glenn Beck program.
Imagine a darkness, something darker and scarier than the deepest parts of the ocean. Darker than that awful darkness of space, the darkness of night, a house shackled by darkness because there isn't any electricity, and there hasn't been for months. But then again, that's not the dark I'm talking about. The real dark is the dark part that lives inside of you, the things that you now have to do on a daily basis just to stay alive. Around the corner, you hear the bestial shouts from a Caracas jail. The prisoners have taken over, at least that's what you hear. They feel they can do a better job of controlling themselves than whoever has been doing it lately. It was 100 years ago that this country was lavished in wealth. Not too long ago, you too were rich. You were healthy in that chubby 19th century Russian diplomat way. You ate well. You probably ate too much. Black turtle beans and fried bananas, asado negro. You drool just thinking of the tender shredded beef and the carrot and oregano tinged broth. You strode through steakhouses on special occasions. You ate T-bones like a Texan. You drank Chilean wines, Malbec from Argentina. Occasionally, a glass of cognac. Not because you were drunk, but because you could. Because you enjoyed the sprouting goodness that life had to offer. Man, that life, it seemed like it was never going to end. Now look at yourself. You're a bag of bones. Bones jutting out like false teeth. At times, you think about all the energy you waste just breathing. What happened? Now you can barely afford a single egg. One egg. Eggs that fall out of the backsides of chickens, and I can't afford it? Your mouth quivers at the thought of a fried egg tender. So tender it pops open with just the prod of a fork oozing onto the fried papaya and rotisserie chicken. You've lost 120 pounds since it all started going to hell. And now, you're in it. Firmly. You weren't rich, you were middle class, lower middle class even. That's just how good things used to be. Although there was always the cinder block hovels that you can see from the plane as you land in Caracas. But now it has spread. The office, where you used to work as an accountant, it's now empty, abandoned, overtaken by squatters, people like you who lost everything, who limp a little more each day toward their death. Men all in black now patrol the streets with shotguns, black bulletproof vest and black tarp-like shirts and black pants, black military boots. People hamper cars in the street because there's nowhere to go, nothing to do. Gasping a bit, you rest below a crucifix statue, the left tilting head of Christ emblazoned in a soft and sad light, the burnished rise of daylight breathing into a new day. Looking at Christ, perhaps for the first time you understand suffering. You understand his defeated look, the look of hopelessness and violence and death. The hopelessness of surrendering, and surrendering until it stops mattering. You hope. You have that one hope left, that all things will change. But you really hope that just anything begins to change. It was all so promising at the beginning. Everybody was going to be able to live the high life. And now, only a handful are, and they are the ones that live behind the gates. This, you think to yourself, this is the socialist utopia they promised all of us as Venezuelans? As you sit there under the statue, you begin to replay it all in your mind and wonder, where are all those Americans, those celebrities, those from Hollywood that praised our leaders and helped convince us that this was the road to prosperity? I wonder what they're eating tonight. I have a feeling they're eating very well. This is the hypocrisy. This is why the media is an enemy of the people. Not because they're against Donald Trump or anything else, but because they will not tell you the truth. Where are the big, long specials on Venezuela and how it all happened? Where are the demands for the apologies from those who brought this socialism to Venezuela? I can tell you right now that if a capitalist country would implode and you had the very rich and the very elite of this grotesque capitalist system living the high life, taking the gold from the country currently, holding it hostage, forcing people to starve, fixing elections, I can guarantee you CNN would be there 24/7. They would be talking about it nonstop and saying, this is why we need socialism. But where is the media today? Where are the leaders today that will actually stand up and say, wait a minute, hold it. We're all talking about socialism. Can we stop and look at what socialism has done? Can we just stop and ask a few people? Hey, Sean Penn, do you remember when you said this?
He is one of the most important forces we've had on this planet.
Él es una de las fuerzas más importantes que tenemos todos en este planeta.
And I will wish him nothing but that great strength he has shown over and over again.
Y yo no deseo nada más que esa inmensa fuerza que él tiene siga derramándose sobre todos nosotros.
I do it in love.
En el amor.
And I do it in gratitude. I just want to say that from my very American point of view,
quiero decir desde mi muy americano punto de vista,
of my friend President Chavez,
a mi amigo el presidente Hugo Chávez,
it is only possible to be so inspiring as he is, as a two-way street.
Solamente es imposible no estar inspirado con su ejemplo.
And he would say that his inspiration is the people.
Hugo Chavez praise after the death of Hugo Chavez. Praise for the new bus driver, Maduro, who was one of the people, who will be democratically elected, and he will continue this proud tradition of Chavez. They will feed you a lie of fiction now, that Chavez was doing it right. It was Maduro. Well, that falls apart in two places. One, the economy was already falling apart. Everything was falling into disrepair at the end of Hugo Chavez. And my greater point here is this is democratic socialism. You're going to elect somebody. He's going to be the greatest. He's going to bring Barack Obama. He gave us Obamacare. And as it starts to fall apart, the democratically elected successor has to pick up the pieces. And at some point, it gets so bad that one of these successors just has to stop the elections. They just have to stop these people because it's the people who are complaining that are causing all the problems. Where is Danny Glover today? Has anyone seen Danny Glover? Is he on television being asked, hey, how you feeling about Venezuela now? Because you were a big supporter when you said things like this.
Well, first of all, I consider the President Hugo Chavez my friend. And certainly an ally about the things that I talk about in the world and that he talks about in the world. I ought to talk preciously about the country that people often consider me a descendant of and from, Haiti. Haiti is something very special to me. And so when I talked to the president about Haiti, he understood there was a fundamental relationship that Latin America, and particularly Venezuela, and the Bolivarian Revolution had to Haiti.
Haiti, otherwise known as Haiti. Danny Glover will say, well, that I was talking about Chavez. But here he is in 2014 giving a speech next to Maduro, supporting Maduro.
So proud to be with you.
Estoy muy orgulloso de estar con ustedes.
As we commemorate and celebrate a true man of the people,
Es estimulante
Hugo Chavez.
Poder celebrar a Hugo Chávez.
His memory lives with us.
Su memoria vive con nosotros, él vive con nosotros.
Through the work that you do as citizens of this great nation, as you continue to realize his vision of a participatory democracy, one involving all citizens.
También importante que a través de su pueblo realizó la democracia.
In context with his elected leaders who are the stewards of this democracy.
Fue un líder electo que pudo levantar la democracia real.
It is a task that is very difficult, but a task that you are up to.
Es una tarea muy difícil.
Es una tarea muy difícil para lo cual ustedes están preparados también.
It is a task with many challenges, but he knows that you will continue the fight that he gave his last breath for, a free, democratic, self-determining Venezuela.
That's fantastic, if any of it were true, as he had his arm around Nicolas Maduro as he was saying it. If you think that the socialists really believe in a self-determining group of people, an exchange of ideas, then why are they silencing so many people today in America? Don't you see? They don't show up in black boots. They don't show up in scary uniforms. Germany, they showed up in those black uniforms, but those weren't scary at the time. Those were sharp uniforms. They were designed by Hugo Boss. They instilled confidence in the people. They thought, oh, wow, look at them. I want to be a part of that. Now, only now, do you know what they really mean. And now those uniforms are frightening. They show up as friends. As Ronald Reagan said, I'm from the government. I'm here to help. The most frightening words anybody has ever spoken. If they truly are going to create a utopia where all of us can express ourselves, then why are they silencing us today? Why is that Noam Chomsky? Why is that Oliver Stone, Danny Glover, Sean Penn? You all should be held accountable for what you said. And I know you're going to have an excuse. Well, they just didn't do it right in Venezuela. They never do it right. Shame on you, Hollywood. And shame on you, American press. Where are you as people languish in the dark and starve?
The best of the Glenn Beck program. Like listening to this podcast? If you're not a subscriber, become one now on iTunes. And while you're there, do us a favor and rate the show.
Jeff Giesea is online with us. He has put a bunch of comments out on Twitter that I thought was interesting, a Twitter thread. I'd like to elevate the way we talk about censorship issues. Let me offer a few quick thoughts on language around these issues, how I'm currently thinking about them. We thought we would get him on and have him lay it out for us. Hello, Jeff. How are you?
Hey, Glenn. How are you?
I'm good. Tell me, can you guide us through it all, a logical way that we can have freedom of speech? Companies can be themselves and, do what they feel is right while still having freedom of speech and getting the government out of bed with these people.
Yeah, exactly. So let's try to frame the discussion. I mean, first, we all care about freedom here, right? We want to live in a free society. The question is, what does it mean to live in a free society when there are these incredibly powerful tech companies and global services that have a ton of market share and that, conceivably can kind of kick you off for any reason?
Right.
So that's what I'm wrestling with. I kind of come at this with this freedom libertarian type orientation, but I recognize that the issues get a lot more complicated in this era. And so I've been trying to elevate the way we talk about these issues and just advance this dialogue because I think it's incredibly important to the future. So I'm really grateful to be on your show to talk about it.
No, I really appreciate it. We do not have serious discussions on this. We have a bunch of politicians throwing things back and forth, and people are just, I think on this issue, they become outraged by it, and then they don't know what to do, so they just hook their wagon to some politician. And I don't think we're having a serious discussion about this in society. So where do we begin?
Right. Well, I think it begins with talking about it and trying to wrap our heads around it and understand what are the right questions to ask. And I think, we've heard about, just to kind of poke at you a little bit, I mean, we've all heard about the Chinese social credit system where they're monitoring its citizens, and if the citizens don't behave properly, they'll get demerits and they won't be able to take the train and stuff like that. Well, in our society, a privatized version of totalitarianism is still totalitarianism. Like,
yes.
In some sense, we're evolving this American social credit system. So
hang on just a sec. When you say poke at me, you don't think I disagree? Because I think China is building 1984. We're building Brave New World. It's the same thing.
Exactly. It's just privatized. So maybe we don't disagree. But so I talk to my friends who are passionate Christians, and they care a lot about religious freedom. And I generally support them. I happen to be a gay guy. But like if Masterpiece doesn't want to sell me a cake for my fabulous wedding, that's no big deal. I can go to a different bake shop.
Right.
But if Amazon bans me from selling my books on Amazon for whatever reason, that's really devastating.
Correct.
So
however, there is, and I agree with you, but that's where the discussion needs to be. they're a private company, but they're still a massive private company. So I agree with you 100%. We have to talk about that. But how do you balance the libertarian, hey, it's still a private company with...
So in my eyes, it comes down to market share and consumer choice. And I think, like in the case of Christians, I ask them, what's going to happen when the SPLC labels you a Christian extremist because you don't like you don't support gay marriage, which in my book is fine. Like, I can respect that.
Right.
But what's going to happen when you refuse to bake my cake and then you get banned from Uber? Right?
Right.
What's going to happen? Like, those are two very different things. So for me, a lot of the discussion comes down to consumer choice. If there's a service that has a ton of market share, like Amazon just dominates book distribution, Uber dominates ride sharing, that's a different phenomenon. Or PayPal dominates online payments. That's a different dynamic than if I have lots of choice in the marketplace and there are 5 bakeries in town and this one doesn't want to make me a fabulous cake, so I'll just go to a different one. So I think that's one element for us to think about. I think another element is...
And how do we solve that?
Two ways. One is I think having a broader conversation about political discrimination and religious discrimination in the commercial landscape, because we want to balance the ability for businesses to choose their customers, because that's part of their freedom on the one hand. And yet on the other hand, I think recognizing that with global services that have a ton of market share, maybe that's not okay.
So
should they be able to ban me for wearing a MAGA hat? And I go to, should my bank be able to say, I don't want to serve you because you voted for Trump?
Correct.
Or should my airline be able to say, you're not allowed to fly on American Airlines anymore because you voted for Trump?
Right.
That feels very wrong to me. Or my internet service, that may be different because they're a telecommunications app, but my cell phone or whatever could say, I don't want to serve you anymore because you're a Christian extremist. That seems very problematic to me.
Correct. And I guess it is market share that makes it so frightening. However, let me push back from a libertarian standpoint. If I create a company and I grow to be huge because there's nobody else that it was doing what I did, and why should I then be punished as long as I'm not obstructing? See, this is I'm tying myself in a knot here, Jeff, because the only thing that I cannot solve on the capitalist system is really the de Tocqueville problem. He said in Democracy in America that at some point the rich will get so rich they will kick the door behind them and not allow anybody else through. And that's true. Now, not all rich people do that, but some do. I talked to Ray Kurzweil, and I said, what makes you think that Google is not going to just notice what I'm doing online and say, they're trying to build a competition to me, to Google, and just start banning them, start changing, the information? Why wouldn't someone who has a dark heart, do that? And he said, because people won't. You don't know people. People will always do that kind of stuff. So I don't know when you have that much power and you don't have the morals to underpinning of saying, no, I don't want to screw people. I made it and somebody else can make it, and competition will just make me stronger. I don't know how to solve that.
Well, I think you are helping solve it by advancing the conversation. I think one angle, I think there are a lot of different angles. There's no one magic bullet, but I think antitrust is certainly part of the equation here, and maybe reevaluating how we think about antitrust and at what point, Elizabeth Warren proposed breaking up tech companies. I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but that is one angle of kind of attack on these issues. And I just did an analysis of social media, how much is social media impacting our democratic discourse? And what I found is that American use of social media is dominated by 8 platforms, and Facebook-owned platforms, Facebook itself, Facebook also owns WhatsApp and Instagram, dominates about half of all social media activity. among Americans. And then Google controls 90% of the search market. So imagine all the times that you're searching for information. And on top of that, they own YouTube, which is the most used social media and the dominant video sharing one. And they're an investor in Snapchat, which, as you know, is really popular, especially among young people. So you look at the landscape, and we have 8 platforms with 2 companies controlling, how we make sense of the world and filtering the information that we receive.
Right.
And social media is unique because it's participatory. It's not like we're sharing and creating information in addition to consuming it.
So what do you think of the what do you think of the argument between platforms and publishers, that they're trying to have it both ways? They have the protection of a platform because they could not survive. YouTube couldn't survive if they were going to be sued for everything anybody ever posted. Facebook couldn't survive. But that's a platform, and they have to say, I'm an editor, I'm a publisher, or I'm a platform. If you're a platform, you got to let it ride because you can't edit. Otherwise, you are responsible for the content because you're editing, unless it's illegal. Why not just make them platforms or publishers? And publishing is a total different set of rules, and congratulations on that. You're going to get sued all the time.
Right. Well, I think, okay, let's talk about policy and then politics, because you're referring to Section 230,
yes,
which is what protects these platforms from getting sued for the content that they're searching. So,
which
if,
seems like that's the root of the problem.
Well, but it gets more complicated because let's be honest. Like, I think threatening to revoke Section 230 protection is really effective political move. Saying, listen, we're going to pull this, like, we're not going to protect you anymore if you're going to act like a publisher and tweak your algorithms and steer people to this politically biased information and disproportionately bias everything against conservatives. Like, so I think it works politically to threaten it. In practice, I think it's a really bad policy that would basically destroy the internet. So I'm not sure that's exactly the right approach.
How would it destroy? I want to understand. I'm not pushing back to be.
Well, if I could if I could sue Google for anything that Google indexes, that's just going to be a nightmare.
Correct.
And I think so. So I think you're taking a grenade approach when a smarter policy approach would be to a more surgical approach and maybe change the language of requirements around Section 230 and get in there and say, you know what, we recognize this protection's vital to the internet, but we're going to tweak the language. And if we find that you're having disproportionate impact or bias against conservatives or against our democratic discourse,
against anybody,
against anybody, then we're going to. So I think a more surgical approach to finessing that language and adding requirements might be a smarter approach than just yanking it.
I just assumed that no one in their right mind would take that deal. They would all back up and go, okay, because you're right. It will shut everything down. That protection has to be provided because no company could handle it. And I just assumed that they would all be wise enough to go, okay, we'll behave.
I mean, the reality is these big platforms do have too many legal protections. So I do think that I'm not a big fan of, litigious culture at all, but I do think that they are overly protected and that we can finesse some of the language. So I think when we look at policy solutions, looking at it more with a scalpel rather than a grenade is a much smarter approach. I mean, I asked some friends what they thought made sense policy-wise, and they specified with platforms with more than several million users, maybe that's when they should fall under certain requirements, right? Because when you have a global platform, that's different than having a local retail shop.
Right.
So
we were talking, Jeff, about being demonetized, and I'm wondering how much of that is just from companies, advertisers, saying, we're Mercedes-Benz. I don't want anything political. I don't want anything that could be controversial. And them just not having different categories or levels and just saying, okay, no advertising because some advertisers don't want this. How much of it is that, and how much of it is an agenda to silence?
I definitely think there's an agenda to silence. I mean, you may be familiar with Sleeping Giants. That's the name of a left-wing advocacy effort that basically tries to remove threatened advertisers who are advertising on Tucker Carlson's show or on Fox or whatever. And they pulled the plug on all of Breitbart's advertising or a lot of their algorithmic advertising. So it's pretty devastating for a lot of these businesses. So I definitely think the advertising censorship issue is big, and it's kind of a structural way to really take the legs out from under conservative media. And they're winning on this front for sure.
They are. How do we fight back without being them?
Well, Glenn, I mean, I think we may have to be them. I think conservatives like to be lofty and pretend like, everything's good and wonderful in the world. And the left is taking this by any means necessary approach. And that's a recipe for losing. And there's a sense in which conservatives are just kind of perpetual losing losers, right? And so I think part of it is bringing the fight back to them, which isn't fun. Nobody likes playing that game. But I think they only stop when we force them to play it by their own rules, as Alinsky would say, right?
Exactly.
So I think So I think that's one step is to push back, take the offensive. I think a second step is just to stop playing the game. What Tucker Carlson did the other night was phenomenal. When he said, no, I'm not going to let you shame me. No, Fox is standing by me. We're not going to be fired. That is really powerful when people learn to just not take the bait with these outrage campaigns, especially when they're fake ones. Now, with advertisers, it's complicated because, Tucker Carlson's show still is losing advertisers. I'm not exactly sure what to do around that other than making our voices heard and felt with the advertisers and demonstrating to them that, like, hey, this is almost a we need to get in the mutually assured destruction mode where, okay, we could play this game, but that's going to be a nightmare for advertisers when you're boycotting us and we're boycotting you and all this stuff, or we could just not play this game. And I think the only way to get to that position is by threatening the left back and saying, no, homie, don't play that. We're not going to do that anymore.
Yeah,
and also I think one third step is getting our dollars together. AstraZeneca, if they're going to pull their ads from Tucker Carlson, well, maybe that's not the best example because people need their meds, but
right.
But like,
right.
Pick your service. If you're going to not advertise, we're going to boycott your service. And so getting organized to make them pay a price for that behavior is another thing we can do.
You're listening to the best of the Glenn Beck program.
Dr. Will Reilly is with us now. Doctor, how are you, sir?
Good. How are you?
Very good. You should refer to me as a doctor as well. I'm, of course, a doctor of humanities, which means I can operate on any portion of the body. I don't know if you know that, but...
Or at least the mind.
Or none of it. Anyway, you are a real professor, a doctor of political science, and you have looked through all of the hate crimes that have been reported over the, last 15 years?
Well, it's actually a closer time frame than that, or a narrower time frame. I mean, my book focuses on really the last 5 years.
5 years.
My research window was 2012 to 2017, so I guess last 6.5 years now. But yeah, what I find is that a very large number, I wouldn't say of all hate crimes, if you look at the allegation that someone had a word shouted at them outside a fraternity party on either black or white individual, but a very large percentage of the high-profile, widely reported recent hate crimes, more than half, have been fakes. So, I mean, we saw Jussie Smollett a couple weeks ago now. Man claimed that he was beaten up at 2 o'clock in the morning in Chicago by two white bodybuilders with MAGA hats on. They turned out to be Nigerian, that had a rope, a gallon bottle of bleach. They chanted, "Build the wall, this is MAGA country." That turned out to be a complete fraud. He's currently facing 16 felony charges. Literally a week before that, we saw Covington Catholic, where the claim was that this group of prep school athletes had surrounded a literal Native American Indian elder. I think he was a shaman. They chanted, "Build the wall." They tried to take his tribe's sacred rain drum. And going back through a whole bunch of these, I mean, you've got Eastern Michigan, the graffiti incidents targeting African-American students, allegedly. Air Force Academy, where a general literally had to show up on campus and speak denouncing racism. A young black girl in Grand Rapids who claimed that boorish white men literally urinated on her. Pretty painful to read. Kean College with the death threats. Wisconsin Parkside with the nooses. Just a few more, but I mean, UVA, the Virginia quote-unquote rape scandal a couple of years ago, where the fraternities were allegedly running anti-feminist rape rings that made the front cover of Rolling Stone, kind of the OG scandal, Duke Lacrosse. All of these turned out to be fake. And because I had personally had some connection with two fake hate crime incidents in Chicago as a graduate student, one of the city's best-known sort of young hipster bars burned down. The owner said that this was because he was a gay man. That turned out to be false. I became interested in why there was this remarkably high rate of false reporting in this category. So, I mean, I think there's some good jokes and so on in the book, but I used modern scientific technology to look into why.
So what you found, I'll let you reveal, but it is it's very Saul Alinsky, or in a way, it's very progressive in a way that people feel justified in doing it.
Yeah, well, I think that's an excellent point. So I think there are a couple of levels there. The first is just that there are a very large number of hate crime hoaxes and frauds. This isn't, as it's sometimes presented, I think there's an article in Vox, actually, after Jussie Smollett, just a few cases being amplified by the right. I mean, putting together hoax, I was able to fairly easily compile a data set of 409 confirmed hate crime hoaxes. That's currently up to 516.
Jeez.
Almost all of these occurred within the last 5 years. As I said, that data set's available to anyone who wants it, by the way. I've gone on a range of right and left media. I'm very confident in that.
Would you put, what was the kid's name that was killed with the hoodie? You know, this could be my son. Trayvon Martin. Would you put Trayvon Martin in that category?
No, actually, because I think this is something that'll be challenged, not just in that public sector where I enjoy debating and arguing, but in academia, I defined a hate crime hoax very narrowly, actually. The data set easily could be 3 or 4 times as large as it is. And I especially didn't include most sexual assaults. There's a fairly high rate of false reporting there as well, especially on the campus. And I explicitly didn't include a lot of these police shootings. And the reason for that is that there was no filed charge of hate crime. The initial allegation was that this is a hate crime per se. But if you look at a bunch of those, like Michael Brown, that is, I would say, an additional example, a different type of example of a false created narrative. If you remember, hands up, don't shoot.
Yes.
The gentle giant, he was walking away from the police. They said he had tears on his face.
Right.
And he was shot down in cold blood. It turns out that Michael Brown had committed a strong-armed robbery of another person of color, sympathetic local store owner, well-liked, earlier that day. He came into conflict with the police because he was walking literally down the median of a busy street. Cop couldn't tolerate that, got out of his car to confront him. Brown grabbed the officer's gun. These are big men. I mean, Michael Brown was 17, 18, 6'5". Darren Wilson was 6'4". There's a vicious struggle. Brown's fingerprints are on the slide of the weapon, the trigger guard of the weapon. I mean, I'm a pistol instructor. I know what that means. Wilson finally discharged, I believe, 2 shots, and unfortunately there's a death. But many of those narratives, and this will be in my next book, actually, but many of these narratives that come out of the Black Lives Matter movement, and also the alt-right response to that, by the way, are, in addition, fictional. But those are not in this book. This is just about fake hate crimes, and there were more than enough to fill up a book.
You know, I want to go deeper into this with you. I'm going to take a break for a minute, but I have to ask you this: you're also a gun instructor?
Yeah, I'm a pistol instructor for the National Rifle Association. I also do hand-to-hand combat martial arts. But I mean, the ability to kill your enemies is exactly equivalent to the right to be free.
How the hell are you a professor? I mean, you are an oddball. You what? How did you get that job?
Well,
or keep? Let me say that. How did you keep that job?
Well, there's a funny answer there, and that's that I teach at a historically black college. Political correctness, minorities, blacks and Asians, tend to vote for conservative but democratic political candidates, vote heavily for the Democrats. I'd like to see that change so there's more valuation of your vote. But the entire far left culture of outrage, whether that's the trans movement perhaps or constant marches through campus against racism, that's to a large extent absent from the black colleges where everyone in leadership is an upper middle class black guy. So, I mean, I would say that probably 20% of our professors are conservatives. I would say I've gotten really no backlash about writing the book. So it is interesting to contrast that at Kentucky State.
Wow.
It's interesting to contrast that with a primarily white institution of equivalent size and rank, where you'd be talking about Evergreen State, Portland State, Drake. So, again, obviously heavily Democratic voters to some extent when we vote in the black community, but every single one of the most extreme, outraged leftists I've ever met is a privileged upper middle class white kid. So I actually think that where I am teaching is fairly accepted that I've written a right-leaning book.
The Blaze Radio Network. On demand.
We have $130 trillion of future unfunded liabilities coming at us, primarily in Social Security, Medicare, pension benefits for federal employees, and the interest on the debt over the next 30 years. That's basically $1 million for every household in America.
Thank you all, and thank you to the panelists for being here today. This really is an issue that is so important for our time, but it's an issue that really is kind of taking a back seat these days, and it's something that I think we as conservatives need to do a better job of figuring out how to communicate in terms of urgency to the American people. So I'm excited here to have a conversation for the next 20 minutes or so with our panelists, and I'd like to toss the first question to Senator Perdue. Senator Perdue, as many of you know, is the only former Fortune 500 CEO in the Senate, so he understands numbers, he understands the kind of immensity of the importance of this issue. So I'd like to ask you, Senator, to just kind of try to frame how important the issue is and what the threats are that we're facing.
Well, thank you, Tim. It's why I ran, frankly. The debt crisis has been building for the last 15 to 20 years. It's the greatest threat to national security. I'll try to quantify it very briefly. We have $22 trillion of total public debt. It just clicked over that in the last 2 weeks, by the way. But more draconian than that is the fact that we have $130 trillion of future unfunded liabilities coming at us, primarily in Social Security, Medicare, pension benefits for federal employees, and the interest on the debt over the next 30 years. That's basically $1 million for every household in America. Now, put that in perspective. In 2000, the year 2000, we only had $6 trillion of debt on about a $12 trillion economy. So you can see the draconian growth in debt over the last 15 to 20 years.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Michi, we all know that one of the keys to winning this issue is being able to convince the next generation that this is something that's important, but it's really hard when you're talking about these massive numbers to make it matter, especially to young people. Talk about how you've talked about it in the past.
Well, I think it's really important for folks to understand. Obviously, the youth in America is really going to be the ones that are going to be saddled with all of these problems from a fiscal standpoint. As the debt continues to grow, it's not just the $22 trillion number that the senator mentioned, it's $180,000 per taxpayer in America that they owe on the debt today. And that kind of number, some homes can't even afford to put the next meal on the table, let alone $180,000 to pay for all the spending that has been out of control for many years.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the frustrations that I think many of the people in this room have, and that we all have as conservatives, is that we've had opportunities as a party, as the Republican Party, to tackle this and have failed to do so. I think back to I think back to 2010 and that huge election in 2010 with the Tea Party wave. And I remember the kind of contract with America that the party put forward going into that election. And the promise to the voter was that within the first 100 days, we'll cut $100 billion in federal spending. Well, we got in, and then we had some backtracking on that, and then the leadership decided, oh, let's not really cut the $100 billion. We're going to prorate it for the amount of days we've already been in session. It was insane. And that kind of stuff really frustrates and kind of, in my experience, has dispirited our activist base. How do we re-engage our activist base on the issue?
Well, let's talk about what we have accomplished since that watershed era, and I was a part of that. Yep. What we've done since then on discretionary spending, we need to, I'm sorry, my wife says I can bring any cocktail party to its knees talking about this, but if you'll bear with me for a minute, this is what we spend today. We raise about $2.2 trillion in federal tax revenue. We spend about $4.4 trillion all in. That's mandatory and discretionary spending. We also collect money into the trust funds for Social Security and Medicare. That's it. But the problem today is that our discretionary spending is about $1.3 to $1.4 trillion. Now that's fairly flat compared to 2009. Actually, we've reduced spending in real dollars. The growth is in the mandatory side, the $3 trillion that does not get affected by the budget process. This is what we're trying to change. We do a budget up here that's a fraud. The budget we do in the United States federal government is, in Congress anyway, only deals with the $1.3 trillion of discretionary spending, not the mandatory spending, and that's where the problem is. The growth in the debt over the next 10 years is primarily in mandatory spending. It's so bad right now that we are borrowing more than our discretionary spending, which means that every dime we spend in our discretionary spending, that's military, VA, and all domestic programs, is fundamentally borrowed money. Right. It's so bad that we have these bilateral defense agreements with the rest of the world. One of them is South Korea, Japan, Taiwan. Taiwan's a good example. We have an agreement with Taiwan that says that if Taiwan is invaded by China, we have to go to Taiwan and help defend Taiwan against China, but to do that, we got to go to China and borrow the money to go to Taiwan and help defend Taiwan against China. Now, you can see how ludicrous that is, but that's the absolute truth. And that's why this crisis, people say all the time, well, when did the crisis start? When does it start? It started sometime about 5 to 10 years ago when we set off this path on mandatory spending.
Yeah. At Heritage Action, we have activists across the country, and one of the things that they really need and that we all want are things that we can support, tangible things that we can support to help make a difference. Senator Perdue has just introduced a resolution on the debt issue that I think is fantastic and is worth everybody taking a look at. I wonder if you'd take a few minutes just to kind of talk through what that does.
Well, I mean, a resolution doesn't do anything. It just tells the world, hey, we think this is important. And we want to vote on it because we believe that the national debt, this $22 trillion of debt, is the greatest threat to our national security. Those aren't my words. That's General Mattis, Admiral Rand. There are a number of military experts who have said for years that this growing debt is the greatest threat to national security. But it's also a great threat on our social institutions. We can't do the right things for our people anymore because of the size of this debt. And the more interest rates grow, the lower capability, well, the fewer capabilities we have to do that. Let me just show you how bad it is. Just in the last 2 years, the interest alone, while we've maintained some control on discretionary spending, interest rates have gone up $450 billion. Now that's unmanageable, and we're still in a low quartile of interest rates. If interest rates go back to their 30-year average, Tim, we will be spending $1 trillion on interest. That can't happen. We just physically can't do that.
Yeah, and so one of the things I think many of you, especially those of you who are on college campuses, when you start to talk about this issue, I'd imagine that the first thing that gets thrown back in your face is your liberal friends saying, well, look what's happened to the debt and deficit under this president. Look what's happened based on the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Michi, why don't you take a crack at this and then Senator follow up? I'd love to hear kind of how you would encourage folks to respond to that.
Well, I think it's really important to understand two things that when we talk about how to talk about this issue with young people. First of all, debt is a destabilizing force. People can plan for as much as they want when they're young, whether they want to plan for their future, whether it's a family, it's a business, it's a home. The debt can wipe out all of the planning in 1 minute. You just won't know. And the second thing that's important is we have to take the opportunity that we have to fix the problem. And the senator really brings up an interesting point. We are running out of capabilities to solve this issue as each day goes by. So we're on a path right now where there is a way out for Congress to be responsible, and the president has done some things to make sure that there's a way for spending policy from an administrative standpoint to be taken under control. But it's up to Congress. They have the tools, they have the authority, and if they don't take the opportunity, there isn't going to be a solution. One is going to be forced upon, and that's the young people who are going to suffer for that.
Yeah.
Well, let me take a stab at, the president's called this out in the first meeting that he had, that I was included in, 2 weeks after he was inaugurated. He said, job one is growing the economy. Well, why do you need to grow the economy? Well, we need two reasons. One is to get people back to work, but also to have a long-term impact on the debt process. And so what we've done, there are 5 areas you have to work on. 3 are underway right now under President Trump. Now, we don't talk about it in a lot of ways, but this is the reality of what we're doing. In that first meeting, we said we had to grow the economy. Regulations, we pulled back over 2,000 regulations now in 2 years. Energy, we've released 2 mammoth energy projects, such that today we're exporting more energy than we're importing as a country, the first time in 100 years. The third thing is growing the economy. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the greatest economic turnaround in U.S. history. 5 million new jobs. We're growing the economy 100 basis points greater than the Obama administration. Oh, by the way, that was 8 years of the lowest economic growth in U.S. history. The next thing is we have low unemployment. We've got the lowest unemployment in 50 years, lowest African American, Asian, and Hispanic unemployment ever measured. So this is moving in the right direction. And what we found is if you do the right things of what we believe, you can get good results. So it's regulation, energy, taxes. We passed a historic tax bill that eliminated a repatriation tax bill, made our corporations competitive with the rest of the world. And last year alone, $1 trillion of unrepatriated U.S. profits came back into the economy. So collectively, we've freed up about $6 trillion to come back into this economy. The last thing is we passed a historic, bipartisan, by the way, bill to repeal the most onerous parts of Dodd-Frank. And I'm here to tell you, that has a profound impact on small banks. Now, here's what's coming. We are working on these 3. The next one, the regulation, we are going to grow the economy. We've got to fix the budget process, cut redundant spending where we can, and a lot of that is in mandatory. But we've got to save Social Security and Medicare because these trust funds go to 0 in 8 and 12 years respectively, and that's where most of the increases in the next 10 to 20 years is coming from those 2 social programs. And the last is we as conservatives have to finally start the debate about health care costs, not just the insurance. That's what the distraction of Obamacare was. We've been spending a decade talking about insurance. We need to start talking about the drivers of health care, which is causing Medicare to go up. And let me say this about the tax bill. The Democrats are lying about the tax bill. Yes, the debt is up, but we've lowered the debt curve by $3 trillion because the economy is growing. You'll never read that in the liberal press. The next thing is I believe right now we've got an opportunity to continue that as the economy continues to grow. But the tax bill that we passed last year, they said, oh, it's going to add $1.7 trillion of new spending. Well, that's true, except that the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, says if you grow the economy 0.5%, and we're doing twice that, it more than pays for itself. And if you grow 100 basis points, which is 1 point, then you add $300 billion to the federal tax revenue, and we're seeing that today. So that's the lie of the left, that all this investment back into American productivity and American innovation is not working. Well, it is working. We've just got so much work to do, and most of it is on the mandatory expenditure side of our income statement.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that. I'd add one thing. I would say that if you have that kind of conversation, it is an opportunity to point out a very deep principle, a very deep philosophical difference than we have with the left, and that is that tax cuts were not the government's money in the first place. It was the people's money in the first place. So, and it's good. We need that kind of contrast. We need to have that kind of contrast. So I think we have an opportunity going forward here, especially given how crazy the left has gone on the issues that they're proposing, specifically with the Green New Deal proposal out there. I think we have an opportunity to contrast where they want to go in terms of debt and deficits and where conservatives want to go, and especially do that by highlighting how they would intend to pay for the Green New Deal. I think there's just been a few reports out lately about how they're going to do that. Senator, you want to talk through how they're going to do that? And then Michi, I think I want to hear how we should be talking about it as well.
Well, Jay Powell was in the banking committee hearing 2 days ago, and I asked him this question about how the left really proposes to pay for the Green Deal, the new Green Deal, is with MMT. This is modern monetary theory. I don't know where they got that, but what their theory is that debt doesn't matter, and that to pay for the Green Deal, all you need to do is just keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. This is such a naive thought in the world of debt that I can't even respond to it. I mean, this is so immature and naive that it just can't, there's no way it can work. And so what we are really up against is a very stark contrast between what we believe, economic opportunity for everybody, fiscal responsibility, limited government, and individual liberty. And it all ties back. If we get back to those principles, what President Trump's first 2 years have proven is getting back to that actually works. Look at the economic turnaround we have going right now. And if that continues for the next few years, we'll begin to further prove that what we believe in actually works.
Michi, thoughts?
Well, thank you. You know, the senator's right, and I think we heard it this morning from Chairman Schlapp, and, you know, he was up on stage and he talked about how, you know, there's nothing new about the Green New Deal. These are the same failed ideas that have not worked for a long time. And the only thing that's different now is they're just not telling you how much they think it's going to cost, because they know the number is so astronomical that nobody's going to believe it. And so I think we have to be very careful that when we are talking to folks, young folks, that they're not tantalized by the allure of all these things that they think that they want, and there's no cost in terms of how to pay for it. We have to give real solutions to the real problems of our debt and how that's impacting young people who want to start a business, who want to start a family, who want to be successful, who may want to be a Fortune 500 CEO one day. You know, they have to have that chance, and they can't have it if they are not getting better solutions from our side and talking about it in a way that makes sense.
Let me add one thing
Sure,
to that.
yeah,
I mean, this is, I agree 100%, and this is how draconian it is. The estimate, the conservative estimate of what the new Green Deal would cost us is $93 trillion over 10 years. That's $9 trillion a year. Put that in perspective. We only collect $2 trillion in all federal income tax revenue today. That's how draconian this is. There is no way America can go down that road.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we're working on at Heritage Action is trying to identify a conservative policy agenda going into 2020 that helps to keep the coalition of 2016 together. The political coalition that really President Trump discovered for the Republican Party is a coalition of suburban Republicans, it's a coalition of grassroots conservatives, and it's a coalition of working class Americans that in previous elections had voted for President Obama. And that was the real genius of the Trump campaign, I think, was to be able to bring that group into the fold. I think critical for us is figuring out how to communicate this issue to that specific segment. So, Senator and Michi, if you're in front of a working class community in Georgia, how are you talking about this?
Senator?
Well, I do it every week. Constituents come up here, I go back to the states. It's the #1 issue in my state. Georgia is the best place in the country in which to do business, rated by several relocation magazines. And what we see is if we don't deal with the debt, it affects our ability to do the things we do today: pave roads, educate our children, manage health care. I mean, these are things that we take for granted in the United States. But when you have a $20 trillion debt, and oh, by the way, $22 trillion, and oh, by the way, every year now you have a shortfall of $1 trillion, you lose the ability to do the right thing. Let me give you an example. Right now, farmers in my state were devastated by Hurricane Matthew. And we have been fooling around now for 4 months trying to get a disaster relief bill to them. I'm supportive of that. But here's the punchline, and this is where it hits every one of us in this room directly head on. And that is that every dime that we will send to aid those disasters that we're trying to help right now is borrowed money. And oh, by the way, we want to build readiness in our military. We're reinvesting in there, putting $80 billion more in our military this year. Guess what? Every dime we spend in our military today is borrowed money. This is where it hits you and me. And oh, by the way, you want to solve Social Security and Medicare? Well, some of that is going to affect us in this room. It is not, at this point, to Michi's point, the later we wait to deal with this, the more draconian and more onerous it will be on the solution.
Absolutely.
You know, I would say when you look at people and you want to talk to them, no matter what side of the political spectrum they come from or the policy spectrum that they come from, you know, these are real numbers, and they keep growing, and we can't understand how big 22 trillion is in real time, but it keeps growing. And I think that it's important, whether it's a farmer in Georgia or, you know, someone in Tampa, Florida, where I'm from, who's starting a business, that all of these numbers in the end are going to only matter if Congress can do something, and if the president is able to work with Congress in a way to make sure that economic policies are expanding opportunities for Americans, you're going to see debt go down. Federal revenues are up. The government is getting money. So the problem is, what are we spending it on, and how do we make sure that we can do it in a way that's responsible?
Absolutely. So we've run out of time. I'd ask one parting thought from the senator. You've got a room full of activists here, and you're a leader in the Senate on this issue. What do you need from the activist community across this country?
Hold elected officials accountable. The number one driving force in the bubble here, I'm an outsider in the belly of the beast here. I believe in term limits. I ran and committed to only 2 terms. And I believe that we, you and I, can have an impact on this town, but we have got to maintain accountability of the people that we put in office. Don't put people in office if they're not qualified. Don't keep people in office if they're not doing the job. It's no more complicated than that.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Please thank the panelists.
Great job.
Good job.
Good job. Good job.